On December 8th, 1980, John had breakfast at a local cafe on West 71st Street that he frequently went to. He then had his hair cut in 50s Teddy Boy style. When he returned to the Dakota, he and Yoko gave an interview with RKO Radio. Afterward, John and Yoko posed together for a photographer sent by Rolling Stone. The pose of John being nude in a fetal position next to Yoko, who was fully clothed, was entirely John's idea. At about 4 p.m., John and Yoko left the Dakota and set off for the recording studio. That is because John and Yoko were putting together a follow-up album to be entitled Milk and Honey. John and Yoko spent the next 6 hours working on one of Yoko's songs originally meant for Double Fantasy, called Walking on Thin Ice. When they stopped working at 10:30 p.m., Yoko suggested having dinner at the nearby Stage Deli. But John wanted to return home first and see his son Sean before his son went to sleep. So John and Yoko got into their limousine outside the building that housed the recording studio. And the limousine was soon driving north up Central Park West. Looking out the window on the left side, John saw tall residential apartment buildings, most of which were built in the early and mid-decades of the 20th century. And looking out the window to the right was the beautiful Central Park, where John had spent countless hours walking alone or with his wife and son. John was filled with energy and excitement and hopes for the future. John Lennon, the John Lennon, the brilliant singer-songwriter who, through incredible hard work and talent and good fortune, had become one of the most famous musicians in the entire world. By design, he had remained under the radar for many years. But now he was back, and the whole world would soon know it. Actually, many already knew it. Double Fantasy, the album John and Yoko created, was climbing the charts. John had a million plans in his mind for touring and performing the songs in the USA and the UK and anywhere else that fate would soon take him. John Lennon knew that every door in the world would open for him. Fans would love seeing him again. And when he got to England, as he had planned, his family and friends would also love seeing him again. John was elated. He had seen so much. He had heard so much. He had done so much. At 40 years old, it would seem there couldn't possibly be any more room for any new memories to fill his memory banks. But he was ready for more experiences and memories. He famously said, "Life begins at 40." He also said, "Where there is life, there is hope." And he was so right. John Lennon was ready to once again stand at the top of the mountain and to view the landscape before him and to choose whichever way he wanted to travel. And no matter where he would go, he would be welcomed with smiling faces, cheerful hearts, and loving arms. He knew this, and he was happy. The limousine turned left onto West 72nd Street. A moment later, it stopped. The Dakota's porter stepped forward and opened up the door. Yoko stepped out and walked ahead. John was so filled with joy that he was practically floating in the back of the limousine. He gathered himself together and stepped out of the vehicle and onto the sidewalk. And he took in a deep breath. Though it was early December, it was unseasonably warm out. And John felt the warm air swirling in his lungs. What a great night it had been for him. What a great life it had been for him. And now, everything he ever wanted, everything he ever hoped for, and everything he ever dreamed of was waiting for him. John Lennon's career was on the rise once again. He had new songs done that his fans would love. He was married to the woman that he wanted his whole life, before he even met her. John Lennon was communicating with friends and family, including his son Julian, who he hoped would someday be a musician just like him. And upstairs, in his home, was his son Sean. It had been a long 5 years since he was born, and John, at 40 years old, could easily imagine spending perhaps 50 more years watching his son grow up. John Lennon was living in New York City, the greatest city on earth. John Lennon was living in the Dakota, the greatest, most historic residential apartment building on earth. It was as if all the stars aligned, and John's life was going just as it was supposed to be. Just as he hoped it would be. John took in another deep breath, and he walked past the Dakota's ornate gates. He then heard a ringing in his ears, the kind of ringing one hears when there is no noise, when all is silent. John looked straight ahead, as if in a dream state. There were no sounds of trucks, or cars, or beeping horns, or doors opening or closing, or people talking. There were no sounds of the heels of his shoes upon the pavers below. John kept on walking, past the entry to the security office on his right, and then he passed through the inner gates of the courtyard. It was Monday, December 8th, 1980, just before 11 o'clock in the evening, and the Dakota's courtyard was filled with people that John Lennon had never seen before. It seemed as if there was some sort of party going on. For a brief moment, John wondered why he didn't know about this. But then again, he had been so busy, he figured maybe he just missed the invitation. No matter, he was there now, and the party seemed to be in full swing. At first, it seemed as if it was a costume party, because so many people were dressed as if from a bygone era. Over by the fountain, he saw the two daughters of Thomas Adams, the founder of the chewing gum industry in the 1800s. And over there was William Arbuckle Jameson, the successful coffee merchant, also from the 1800s. In the center of the courtyard, John Lennon saw a Steinway piano. And then he saw members of the Steinway family standing all around it. They lived in the Dakota also, but they lived there in the 1800s. John took a few steps forward, and two men nodded to him. One of the men was Edward C. Clark, the builder of the Dakota. The other was Henry Janeway Hardenberg, the architect of the Dakota. John turned and saw Gustav Schirmer, the legendary music publisher who lived at the Dakota but passed away in 1893. Near him stood Bishop Henry Potter. He was a Dakota resident, but he passed away in 1908. Next to him was actress Judy Holliday. She was a Dakota resident. She passed away in 1965. John turned to his left, and he saw to the right of the South Fountain was novelist Fannie Hurst. She also was a Dakota resident, but she passed away in 1968. To the left, John saw opera singer John Brownlee singing. He was a Dakota resident. He passed away in 1969. And then John saw actor William Henry Pratt, best known as Boris Karloff. He was a Dakota resident. He lived all the way up on the 8th floor, but he passed away in 1969. And next to him was actor Robert Ryan. It was his apartment that John and Yoko purchased after his death in 1973. And he saw that Mr. Ryan was talking to his wife Jessica, who passed away in 1972. John Lennon wondered if he was hallucinating. He had once said that he did not need to take LSD because throughout his life he had always hallucinated and he saw things that weren't real. But what of all of this? John was wondering what was going on. Why was he seeing all these people who lived in the Dakota, but had passed away so many years and decades earlier? What kind of party could this be? He looked around and he saw dozens of others, merchants and publishers and entertainers and writers and photographers, playwrights, actors, and manufacturers. Even though he never met them before, he somehow felt like he knew them. And they all clearly knew him. John was confused. Was this really a costume party? He then looked up and he glanced into a window that led into Studio One, his ground floor office. That was when John caught a glimpse of his wife, Yoko Ono, and his son, Sean Lennon. But they were much older, decades older. It wasn't 1980 anymore. John looked closer, and he didn't see himself with them. But yet there they were. They were healthy, and they were strong, and they were okay. And that was when John realized that the party was for him. All those people were there for him. They were welcoming him. Yes, many of the souls were Dakota residents, but not all of them. The ringing sound had lowered considerably, and John could now begin to hear some recognizable sounds. The first one he heard was a door opening. He turned and saw that it was the door that led to the lobby that he had passed through countless times. John stood still and watched a man walking down the stairs. John stood there as the man approached him. John was speechless. He recognized him immediately because he hadn't changed at all since John saw him last. It was Stu Sutcliffe. John hadn't seen him since he passed away in 1962. John's heart was beating so hard that he felt that people around him could hear it. All of the souls around them watched on in delight as John embraced his friend. And when they finally pulled away, John was speechless. But he was so thrilled to see his friend. There were so many things he wanted to tell him. So many things he wanted to talk about. He just couldn't believe that his friend was standing right in front of him. John then felt someone touching his arm. He slowly turned and then he saw his Uncle George. John lived with him and his Aunt Mimi in Liverpool. John truly loved him. One of the saddest days of John's life was when he lost his Uncle George in 1955, long before John became famous. John quickly embraced him too, and for a moment he felt like a 15-year-old boy again. The men held each other tight and then finally pulled apart. John wondered how much better this night could get. Everything was just fantastic. and the warmth of the New York air was nearly as warm as the blood he felt rushing through his veins and in and out of his heart. The crowd of people behind his Uncle George then began to part as a handsome, well-dressed man steadily walked toward John with a beaming smile upon his face. John couldn't believe his eyes. He quickly took a few steps forward until he was standing directly in front of Brian Epstein. John smiled wide and he hugged Brian, and the two men held each other tight. And Brian whispered to John how proud he was of him. And then John said the same thing to Brian, and he thanked him for everything. When the two men finally pulled out of their embrace, John was so happy, and he looked at his friend Stu and his Uncle George and Brian Epstein, and he was just thrilled beyond any words he could possibly even think or say. John Lennon's body felt so warm, so relaxed. He felt as if he was floating in the clouds. It was then when John felt a soft and gentle hand upon his hand. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. He already knew. John Lennon knew who was holding his hand. And he could feel blood rushing to his face and tears about to rush from his eyes. John did his best to hold himself together as he slowly turned around and faced her. And there she was. My God, she was beautiful. John Lennon's very first muse. Julia. John Lennon's mother looked absolutely radiant, with her hair flowing down over her shoulders and her soft skin radiating in the moonlight. She took John's other hand, and the two of them just stood there like mirror images of each other, staring into each other's eyes, neither ever wanting to ever let go. As they both began to smile so wide that the muscles in their jaws almost began to hurt a little bit. And then the two of them began laughing, and they stepped forward and hugged each other so tight that it seemed as if they would never ever be able to be pulled apart. Tears of joy flowed so much and for so long that it seemed as if they would soon be standing in puddles of their own making. When they finally pulled away, after what seemed like an eternity, John looked around and everyone was smiling and everyone was laughing, and he knew that he was home. He knew he was just where he was supposed to be. He knew he was exactly where fate had brought him. He looked through the window of Studio One once again, and for a brief second, Yoko looked up eyes met. John saw Yoko's eyes twinkle. He saw her head briefly nod. And even though it was only for a brief second, it seemed like it lasted much longer, because he could see that she understood. He could see that she knew that he was safe. She knew that her husband was with friends and family. She knew that her husband was all right. And he knew that Yoko was strong. He knew that Yoko was safe. And he knew that Sean was safe and strong. And in that very moment, he knew he would see both of them again someday. John then looked straight up, and he saw a kaleidoscope of spectacular silvery stars in the sky. He never saw so many stars above New York City before. It was as if he was in the middle of nowhere and everywhere. It was as if he and his mom and his uncle and Brian and Stu and all those around him and all those he had lost so long ago and had now found again were within the safe confines of the timeless Dakota courtyard. And they were all floating through the cosmos, through space and time, where all the worries of the world had been left far behind. And where all great things await for all eternity, as the beauty of anything and everything associated with the Dakota, including the extraordinary life of John Lennon, traveled faster and faster and faster and faster into the future, somewhere across the universe. And so this concludes the story of John Lennon at the Dakota. If you want to learn more about the Dakota and listen to time travel style audio tours that I wrote and produced, they are available over at audibleadventures.com. You could also download the Audible Adventures app for iPhone and Android. If you have any thoughts about this subject matter, please put those in the comments below and share what's on your mind. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. You could also go on Amazon or any other bookseller and order some of my books about the Dakota. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.